Okay, hi everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you for webyeshiva.org from Thornhill, Ontario. We are learning Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Emunot Videot, arguably the first real book on Jewish philosophy. And we are moving along in the introduction, as we mentioned at the very outset of our studies. Emunot Videot is comprised of an introduction and then 10 essays. And the introduction really is where Rabbi Saadia tries to lay the groundwork of what his objective is in writing this philosophical work, the first of its kind. So what I'd like to do, and we're going to be providing some, I think, some important fundamental ideas in today's discussion in section 4 of the introduction. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, and I hope that'll be helpful. As I mention every week, these handouts that we prepare are available on webyeshiva.org's course description, and we encourage everyone to join the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevuchim and Emunot Videot. You'll be able to get updates on what's going on, when the next class is, and so forth and so on. So just to get our bearings, the first three sections of the introduction are where Rabbi Saadia had introduced as far as what he was planning to do. And he really wanted to begin by explaining why the human mind is sometimes filled with confusion and doubt. And that was really what he wanted to present in section 2 of the introduction. Many times people get mired and confused by the corporeal nature of our existence, and that life is filled with challenges that we have to surmount because we are physical beings. And then the second point that he wanted to make is how a person can make efforts to try and eliminate doubt from his mind. So now that once we've explained why man's intellect is filled with doubts and confusions and how to clear those doubts, we will now explain what a particular Arabic word is. And I apologize for providing you with just the Arabic word. It's pronounced i'atakad in Arabic, at least my anglicized Arabic. And it comes from the Shoresh akada, which means to bind. I'atakad is a way of binding information to one's mind. And there's a big controversy as to how to translate this word. I want to be very, very clear that the name of the book that Rabbi Saadia Gaon wrote in Judeo-Arabic was the book of Amanat, which is the book of Emunot, which is issues of faith, and Itakadat, which is normally translated as Deot, which are issues of knowledge. And we haven't really examined what the meaning of that title is. And indeed, what is the difference between faith and knowledge? When I believe something to be true, do I know it to be true, or is it my faith that tells me that it is true? And obviously, there's going to be some gray space between those two issues between faith and knowledge. And how do I know whether something? How do I know when I really know something, and how do I know when I just simply accept it on faith? Now, in the standard Arabic Almara dictionary, this word, i'atakad, translates as belief, conviction, persuasion, faith, creed, tenet, doctrine, dogma, opinion, view, judgment, or idea. I only know this because I studied Arabic when I was in university, and I have this really, really thick dictionary of Arabic words. Accordingly, Ibn Tibon translates the word into Hebrew as ha'emunah, what true belief is or faith is. However, based on what we will learn in this section, Rav Kafich, who is the more recent translator, who translated this work again from the Judeo-Arabic in the 20th century, translates it as hade'ah, knowledge. So it's really interesting that you have one translator translates it as belief, and the other translates it as knowledge. And what becomes a little bit even more confusing is that the word emunah in Hebrew is translated both as belief and faith. Now, I can believe something to be true, but what is the basis of that belief? It can either be based on the faith claims of my religion, or it can be based on my investigation into using scientific inquiry. And based on what I have analyzed and investigated, I can believe something to be true. Let's say the theory of evolution or the Big Bang theory. I can believe those to be true, even though there's not completely irrefutable evidence to those theories. That's why they're called theories. Would that be called a belief, or would that be called a knowledge? And is it a belief that's a faith belief, or is it faith based, or is it based on something more investigative? So as will become clear, Rabbi Sadja in this section is providing us a lesson on epistemology, on how man acquires his knowledge. And it's on that basis that Rav Kafich claims that his translation of this word iatakad is more accurate to call it de'ah, or knowledge. He says in footnote, I just have a little snippet from his footnote in his work. He says, Davar gadol hishmi'anu Rabbeinu kan bahasbiro milat iatakad asher rov harishonim metargim ota emunah shuhu targum bilti nachon behechlet. So he says, I have to tell you, even though most of the earlier translators translate the word iatakad as emuna, as faith or belief, he says, I have to say with conviction that this is clearly an incorrect translation. Va'af Rabbeinu Yehuda Tibon tirgem kan emuna, ula'el b'targamo shem hasefer tirgem deot. He says there's an inconsistency in the Ibn Tibon translation. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda ibn Tibon is living in the 12th century. He is the premier translator of medieval Judeo-Arabic works. He translated the Kuzari and he translated Rabbi Sajja's work. And there's an inconsistency because the title of this work is Emunot v'Deot, and the word Deot is I'atakadat, which means the plural of I'atakad. And why then does he translate it as Deot in the title of the work, and here he calls it Emunah? Vasher l'da'ati hu targum hato'em bioter. And therefore, I think the first time he translated it was more correct. And what we're going to see is, because this is an analysis of how information comes into a man's mind and becomes knowledge, it really is more correct to say, instead of Emunah, to really call it De'ah. So it seems like Rav Kafich makes more sense once we get into this section of the introduction. I'm sorry if this is a little bit picayune or a little bit too technical, but I do feel it really drills down into the very purpose of Reb Sajja's work. In looking at the notes from the Ibn Tibon edition that was published in the late 19th century, we talked about Rabbi Yisrael Kitover, who was the great commentator and collator of all of this information for an earlier generation. He accepts Rav Ibn Tibon's word emunah as the translation of atakat, but he also points out that the word emunah, as I said before, can mean different things. It can mean faith, which is purely based on tradition, but emunah, belief, can also mean belief based on scientific inquiry. And that's what he feels is what the word iatakad is, what Rav Sajja is referring to over here. It means that I know something to be true. So for example, I know that through my scientific observation, the universe seems to be expanding. And so perhaps, just as an example, and based on that, I wish to extrapolate and form a theory that originally the universe was completely condensed into one unitary cell, and then it exploded and there was this big bang, and we're seeing the after effects and the afterglow of the Big Bang. So that's what he feels is what emunah is. And once, and as we're going to see Rav Sajja discuss in this section, that I can take what I believe to be true and refine that belief further through further and further scientific inquiry, through bringing more proofs to myself and to others that what I believe to be true seems to be the truest possible path. So so that's introduction number one to our discussion today. By way of introduction to this area of study, which we're going to talk about, which is epistemology, how a person acquires knowledge of anything. He says the word epistemology is the philosophical study of the nature, origin, and limits of human knowledge. The term is derived from the Greek episteme, which is knowledge, and logos, which is reason, and accordingly the field is sometimes referred to as the theory of knowledge. Epistemology has a long history within Western philosophy, beginning with the ancient Greeks and continuing to the present. Along with metaphysics, logic, and ethics, it is one of the four main branches of philosophy, and nearly every great philosopher has contributed to it. As we'll see, the philosophy of Kalam, which was the Islamic method of philosophical thought that Rabbi Sajja is immersed in the Middle East in the 10th century, is very much interested in the study of what makes man acquire knowledge and how human beings acquire knowledge and how you can know that what you feel you know is correct. Another quote is the relation between reason and faith was a central topic in the medieval period. In the Arabic Persian philosophy, Al-Farabi, who no doubt was influential on Rab Sajja's thought, and Averroes, who lives after Sajja, discussed how philosophy and theology interact, debating which one is a better vehicle to truth. And finally, we get to epistemological dichotomies when we get into the Renaissance era. And even though this is long after the life of Rabbi Sajja, I find it to be helpful for us to break this down into a little bit more simplistic a dichotomy of empiricism versus rationalism, because I do feel that these are two areas of philosophy, of epistemology that Rabbi Sajja is going to be getting into today. So just one more quote. Empiricism is a theory that knowledge is acquired from the senses. How do we know anything? So in the Renaissance era, in the 17th, 18th centuries, the philosophers of that time said the only way you can know something is when you perceive it through your senses. Advocated by philosophers such as Locke, Hume, and Berkeley, it was enthused by the advent of experimental science and developed through the 17th and 18th century. On the other hand, rationalism, which is the opponent to empiricism, is the theory that knowledge is obtained by the application of reason. That is, can I know something a priori without having perceived it from my senses? There was the opposing school of philosophers who said, yes, of course, the mind can be the arbiter of truth independent of what you perceive with your senses. Reason is here given a higher priority than experience and is promoted as the basic foundation in deciding the certainty of knowledge. Classical rationalists include René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, and Leibniz. Okay, now why is this important? Because we're going to see this dichotomy of empiricism and rationalism about how man acquires knowledge in this section of the introduction. So let's get into the text. Rabbi Sajja starts off by saying that i'atakad is defined as any idea that forms in one's mind about a fixed quality of something. And so I may have an idea. I have an idea about a certain concept, and I think that it is a correct idea, but I haven't been able to prove it to myself yet. And so I see, let's say, I see a garment in front of me, and it seems to be that this garment is made out of silk. I haven't felt it. All I've done is I've seen it, and I want to be able to confirm in my mind that the garment that is in front of me is a silk garment. When the cream of one's mental analysis emerges and is completely embraced by the mind, and so therefore, through further analysis, I may actually go ahead and actually touch it and feel it, and through my observations, all of these things really indicate that this is a silk garment. The person becomes convinced of the truth of the acquired idea. He then keeps the memory of that truth in his mind for future use. And therefore, this is what scripture says, that the wise person observes the world around him, proves to himself or extrapolates based on his observations and his sensory perceptions certain truths about the universe around him, about reality, and then stores those memories in his mind. To support that, we have two psukim, one from Mishlei, one from Proverbs, which says, Chachamim yitzbenu da'at, that the wise store away knowledge, ufi evil mechita karova, but the mouth of the fool for him destruction is near. And from the book of Job, Kachna mipiv Torah, take from God's mouth Torah wisdom, v'sim amarav bilvavecha, and place his words in your heart. Store them away. Once you've ascertained truth, store it away. Now, this may seem to be so simplistic. What do you need this for? As we're going to see, Rabbi Sadja is trying to polemicize against people of his time who have different ways of defining how people acquire knowledge. There are two types of yatagad, of this type of belief in truth of the things around you. You can have either true knowledge or false knowledge. True cognition is, for example, that black is black, white is white, what exists exists, what is not existent is non existent. False cognition is perceiving things as they are not, such as something which is very much, multitudinous, is very little, or that something that is very little is much, or that white is black, black is white, that which exists is non-existent, and that which is non-existent exists. The praiseworthy wise man places reality as his foundation and bases his knowledge on true premises. The despised fool, on the other hand, sets up his personal conviction as guiding principle, assuming that reality is patterned after his belief. Through his ignorance, he embraces that which should be shunned and shuns that which should be embraced. And Scripture therefore states about such people, both the wise man and the foolish person, in Proverbs, Chacham yarei v'sar meira, that the wise man is fearful and turns away from that which is evil, evil thought. Uchesil mitaberu boteach. The fool becomes filled with wrath in his confidence that what he's saying is true, and he falls into the trap of falling into his own false ideology. Now, before we go any further in Rabbi Sajja's discussion, I want to say that while this may seem prima facie so obvious and simplistic, it's really not. And if we can enter into the realm of politics and political thought for just a minute, I think one of the great debates between right and left that we're seeing in Western society today is, does ideology outweigh results, or do the results outweigh the ideology? In other words, if I could be so bold, and I don't mean to become partisan in my discussion or to pass judgment, but people who are truly, truly far left in their political views take their ideology, of whether it's a socialist ideology or whether it's an ideology that everyone should have an equal amount, or that we have to help all people and so forth and so on, will take an ideology and say that ideology is more important than what actually is pragmatic and what actually works within society, even if it means that we're going to have to ignore the fact that we're bankrupting a government and that we're bankrupting society and that we're allowing society to descend into chaos and anarchy. It is worth it in order to preserve our ideology. And what you see in certain political enclaves is that ideology reigns supreme, even though what my senses tell me works and what doesn't work should really be the final arbiter of truth. If I want to be able to find the perfect political system, I should look at, through a very careful, stoic, detached analysis, what is the best political system in the long run and what will preserve peace and security throughout society and civilization. And if I look at it that way, and I see what has worked in the past and try to apply that for the future and use through experimentation, trial and error to come up with the best system, that would be a wise way of governing society. If, however, I start with an ideology and I ignore what works and what doesn't work, I ignore history, I ignore any trial and error, then that political system is doomed to failure. And that's an important thing, because it's so simple to speak out using Reb Sajja's terminology, but I don't even think that people are conscious of this when they talk about political systems. So let's go back to Reb Sajja. Sorry about that soapbox for a moment. He says, based on this, I am amazed at some of the people that I have witnessed. Certain people are slaves, but believe they have no master. They are confident that whatever they say doesn't exist, must be non-existent, and vice versa. They make pronouncements without even verifying whether those pronouncements are correct. They are so sunken in their folly. And by the way, when he says people are slaves but believe they have no master, he's referring to people who have thrown off the yoke of divine mastery over themselves. In other words, people who basically become heretics and say, there is no God, I have no God, and so forth. They are so sunken in their folly as to have reached the nadir of mental deterioration. Their delusion does not serve them well. And he gives many examples of how saying that something is so does not make it so. And even though we would like to believe that mind over matter will actually help people in their lives. Many times things are all about attitude, right? Many times a person may be very unhappy, and by making affirmations to himself and changing his attitude, he can change his mental state. But your mental state will not change the reality around you. That's the flip side of that. And that's what Reb Sadia wants to point out. The penniless person who thinks his coffers are full, let him see how that profits him. The 40-year-old who thinks he is 70, see what good it will do to him. And I found that amusing because today it's just the opposite. People who are 70 want to think that they're 40. But in the old days, wisdom and age was a virtue. So a 40-year-old may profess to be like a 70-year-old in wisdom, but see what good that will do him because he lacks the experience and the sage knowledge of old age. A person may convince himself that he is sated when he's actually malnourished, or that his thirst is quenched when in reality he is dehydrated. He may convince himself he is clothed when he's really naked. See what will happen to him as a result. He's not going to be a happy camper just because he says to himself that something is so does not make it so. Let he who has a dangerous enemy think to himself that his enemy has died, so that he doesn't have to take any precautions any longer. Imagine how quickly he will suffer the consequences of these false beliefs. Thinking that you don't have to worry about, and of course, again, small political commentary. What Israel did leading up to October 7th was to imagine that there was no formidable enemy. And look how tragic those consequences were. When you think you don't have an enemy when you really do, and the enemy is at the gates, that's not going to serve you well in the real world. It is sheer folly for people to think that as long as they don't believe in God, they can exempt themselves from his commandments. About such people, scripture states in the beginning of Psalms, Ninateka et moserotemo. People think that they can just cast off the bonds of divine rulership from off themselves, and they are therefore don't have to face any consequences. And then he gives an example of people in India. Hindus brace themselves to endure hot coals, but they are nonetheless burned. Those who wish to highlight their great strength and vigor will allow people to hit them with sticks and rods, but they nevertheless feel pain. In other words, his argument is not that it's completely impossible for the mind to allow you to endure pain, but at the end of the day, the mind has only limited power. So he seems to be placing more stock in empiricism and the reality of the outside world. That the truest reality is in the outside world, and no matter what your mind tells you is real or not real, that's not really where reality lies. It is even worse when people delude themselves regarding the creator of all. In their folly, they will not be saved from that which is wisdom decreed, as it says in Job, Chacham levav va'amitz koach, that he who is of wise heart will remain strong and courageous. Mi hiksha elav vayishlam. But who can harden themselves against God and find peace? You can't. It's not possible. Now, that's the conclusion of section 4. Let's go and begin section 5 of the introduction, which is really a continuation of this discussion. So, based on what I've said, now, says Reb Sadia, I want to tell you how, practically speaking, now that we've clarified that the mind cannot change the reality that is outside of ourselves, now let's talk about how to arrive at truth. Now that I have added the previous information about how man attains i'atakad, a true knowledge of something, by observing and processing that information and basing himself on real life experiences in order to establish knowledge of truth, We should now explain those things which bring a person to truth and correctness. How can we hone that talent to make sure that we acquire correct knowledge? These are the sources of all knowledge and the foundation of all cognition. There are three things that cause a person to know truth, and we'll explain each one in detail. They are, and I'm actually using the terminology of the Renaissance period to really try to clarify what Reb Sadia means. So first, he says the first category is Yedi'at HaNir'eh, the knowledge of that which is perceivable, that which can be seen literally. And that I call empirical knowledge. You know certain things based on what your senses tell you to be true. I perceive that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. That's my Yedi'at HaNir'eh, that's my empirical knowledge. The second one he calls Yedi'at HaSeichel, intuition, or that which comes to the mind independent of the senses. Yedi'at HaSeichel is rational knowledge. You know, what Descartes would extol is, I think, therefore I am, right? The ability to acquire an understanding of things independent of your senses, of reality. And number three, knowledge which is compelled by logic, which he calls Yedi'ah ma sheha'achrech mevi elav. It is a knowledge of that which proofs bring you to that knowledge. And as we'll see, it is the third way of understanding or arriving at correct knowledge by basically using logical proofs to process and refine the things that you have acquired through the first two methods. And through these three methods, you'll arrive at truth. Empirical knowledge refers to any knowledge a person obtains by means of the five senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, or touch. Rational knowledge refers to ideas that emerge in a person's mind independent of his senses, such as the intuition that truthfulness is important and falsehood is depraved. We make moral judgments based not on what we perceive through our senses, but rather there are certain instincts that man has a priori in his mind about what is good and what is bad, about what is right and what is wrong. Those are types of knowledge as well. And therefore, that's also a source of knowledge. And finally, knowledge which is compelled by logic refers to that which, if a person were to not accept this knowledge, he would have to deny his rationality or his senses. Since this is impossible, he is compelled to substantiate that idea. And we're going to give an example of this. For example, we are compelled to acknowledge that every human being has an animating soul, even though we cannot empirically gauge it, but we know that it exists through its effects. So, for example, I can't use empirical methodology to ascertain that a person has a soul. The soul is the thing which gives a person animation and life. But what I perceive is that this person displays all of the symptoms of a being who possesses a soul, that which grants him animation. And so therefore, I have to, that's what's called Yedi'at ma sheha'achrech mevi elav. It is through logic that I must conclude that this person has a soul. We also must acknowledge that man possesses an intellect, even though we cannot empirically engage with it, as we cannot deny its effects. So sometimes you can only detect the effects of something, even though you cannot detect that thing itself, either empirically or with your intuition, but you happen to see certain clues that or symptoms of that thing's existence. And that's the third type of knowledge, which is knowledge through logical proof. We know of many people who deny these three sources of knowledge. Very few can deny the first, empirical knowledge, but we will nonetheless discuss these people in our first essay. Remember, Reb Sadia Gaon's work of Emunot V'Deyot after the introduction is comprised of 10 essays, 10 ma'amarim, and in the first of those 10 essays, we will discuss those people who actually deny empirical knowledge. By rejecting empirical knowledge, these people also automatically deny the second and third forms of knowledge, since they are built upon the first. If you don't believe your senses, then you're more inclined to not believe your rational thoughts, and you certainly will not believe the proofs that you wish to build upon based on what you have perceived. There are more people who admit to empirical knowledge, but reject rational knowledge and knowledge compelled by logic. We will mention their arguments in the first essay also, and we will respond to them. However, the most people who are in error and who reject my three sources of knowledge are those who admit to the first two sources of knowledge, both based on empirical and rational cognition, but they deny the third, that a person is capable of proving things through logic. The reason why there are fewer who deny the first and more who deny the third is because each type of knowledge is more esoteric and invisible than the previous one, meaning that it is quite apparent that the sun rises in the east and rests in the west. That's empirical knowledge. It's much harder to deny that. It's a little bit easier to deny the fact that people have certain intuitions and instincts. And it's even more easy to reject the idea that people can prove things to themselves through logic, because many times, because these things are not visible. And because they're not visible and they're arguable, a person is more subject to refute these possibilities than they are to refute the things like that are gained as empirically, like the sun rising and setting. Okay, accordingly, it is easier to deny that which is hidden than that which is exposed and revealed. There are other people who only accept one truth but reject the other, which they view as being logically antithetical to the first when it's really not. And here, what Reb Saadia Gaon is basically saying is that there are some people who, based upon their philosophy or their logical proofs to themselves, have come to the conclusion that two things cannot coexist, two concepts cannot coexist, when in reality they're in error, and you can have those two things coexist even though they are opposing ideas. For example, one group of philosophers argue that nothing is in motion and everything must be stationary. Another group of philosophers argues the opposite, that everything in motion is in motion and nothing is stationary. And this is an ancient Greek philosophical debate among different schools of philosophy, because motion was one of those things that was heavily debated as how things become in motion. Are things changeable or are they completely unchangeable? If things are changeable, then they must constantly be in motion, because that's what change is all about: changing position, changing place, changing state, and so forth. But on the other hand, if things are completely unchanging, then how can anything possibly be in motion? So it's more of a philosophical debate, but in reality, some things can be at rest and some things can be at motion. Each one provides his own proofs and declares his opponent's proofs to be doubtful and confusing. We, however, the community of those who unify God, substantiate the three sources of correct knowledge, but we add a fourth source. It is a source that was proven to us by the other three sources of knowledge. It is our belief in an authentic tradition, which is based on our sensory knowledge and our rational knowledge. We will explain this further in the third essay of this work. And of course, what he is referring to is the authentic tradition of the Torah that was given to us by God. And this Torah provides us a fourth source of knowing truth. So basically, he said that what differentiates the Jewish people from the rest of the world is that the rest of the world has three means by which to obtain the truth about reality. We have a fourth means of obtaining truth about reality, and that is the authority of the God-given Torah. That, he says, is going to be the subject of the third essay of this work, and how we can know that it contains correct knowledge is something that we will discuss as we go forward. So this is, now we've only started the fifth part of the introduction. Remember, as I mentioned, the introduction is comprised of 8 sections. The fifth section is quite lengthy, so we've only begun it. We may need another 2 sessions to get through it entirely. So we're going to hold it here. I do want to mention that I am going to be traveling next week, so we will not have class next Monday. And Bezrat Hashem, we will have class in 2 weeks from today. But just in case I'm still traveling, I will send out a message both through Web Yeshiva and through the Facebook group. So that concludes our discussion for today. Any questions or comments? I really hope that I wasn't too too technical today. I don't want to chase people away. So if there are any comments or questions, please. Okay. If not, have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Wishing you all a Purim Sameach, and let's see redemption and a return of all of our hostages and peace in our land once and for all. Everyone,
Amen.
Amen.
take
Very
care.
lucky, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Beilah Purim.
You too.